So when we first sat down and watched it with Peter, one of the things he said is that he didn't want the watcher to really have much of a vocal element. The sound for him would be much more about his movement.
I went out to a creek nearby the house. I was playing with the plunger in the creek, and you plunge the water, and you get all these weird like suction sounds.
We were out in the parking lot out here actually with rubber floor mats, wet rubber floor mats, sort of wafting them through the air and slapping them against things.
So we went back and edited that sound in along with all the other plunger stuff, and it worked really well.
The vocalization, which came sort of very late, there's a shot where it just sort of cries out for some sort of pain vocal. In the final mix, I ended up putting a walrus, a pitched down sort of walrus groan there. It just felt right. The Watcher fight itself is one of those cases where effects-wise it's so dense and so well covered, but most of that you'll never hear because we ended up weeding most of it out to let it play with music. The version that you hear now in the final film is really quite sparse and stripped down to really the most essential kind of effects elements. So PJ's idea with the wizard fight was basically to keep it very real in a way that it wasn't so much about their magic as it was about these two old men just beating the crap out of each other in this room, flinging each other around. So it was really about having the realistic Foley sounds, the sounds of them slapping the ground, and not so much about the whizzes and all the sort of magic sounds, but really more just the very physical nature of these two guys getting slapped around.
I remember one weekend I came into the post-production sound facility, and there was our sound designer, David Farmer. He had a mic out by the front windows of the building, and he was taking his hands and kind of streaking them against the glass. And I said, "What are you doing, David?" He said, "Oh, I'm getting sounds for the wizard fight."
Peter was very insistent that we didn't use anything that was at all electronic or sounded created, which produced a bit of a challenge for Ethan and Dave to come up with a movement energy sound that was just like sort of gusts of the wind, wasn't it, really?
Mm-hmm.
No electronics allowed.
Initially, I really wanted to get the sense of what the force that was traveling between the two wizards and trying to figure out a way to do that without having it be sort of unnatural was a bit of a challenge. And so it ends up really just being these sort of sharp, windy gusts.
The chance of aiding me willingly, but you have elected the way of pain.
Creating the sound of the orcs actually calling was one of the first things that we tried out, was using possum screeches, which is something PJ mentioned to us right from the beginning. And so Mike and Dave and a couple other guys took a trip up to the possum, possum research center, about an hour outside of Wellington, and recorded various possums, and that became one of the main elements for the screeching Moray orcs.
All of the actual books, when they're describing the armour that the orcs and Uruks have, they're always talking about the metal shod feet. And so we had in fact 20 pairs of these stainless steel foot plates made up with these small metal lugs on the side. We could actually fasten them under sort of boots and shoes. They're not very comfortable, but you can actually walk around and run around and do various moves. So we had a whole bunch of people with these foot plates as well as other bits of metal.
The thing that becomes kind of difficult about doing orcs, as opposed to other monsters in any monster movie, is that they're very humanoid.
The approach that we sort of ended up with was taking animals, sort of vicious attack animals, and then imitating them with our own voices.
One of the things we used was a pig dog, and we pitched it down, and it's actually one of the best groaning sounds.
It's also one of the challenges in this film is that all the orcs are all different. There's all these various sort of races of orc. And so Moria orcs, visually for instance, they look sort of different from, say, Mordor orcs or Isengard orcs. They're smaller.
Crab-like.
Crab-like, yeah. They're kind of like these big insects.
For some of the initial tests we did for their sounds of movements, I actually took the sound of grasshoppers and different types of insects moving and played with those sounds, slowing them down. And those became some of the initial sort of movement elements that we then expanded on with having the crew in these different props. We ended up, for the scene where the crab-like orcs are crawling across the ceiling and down the columns, we did a lot of stuff with movement in the tunnels using shells we collected from the beach and scraping them against the walls of the tunnels to try and sort of imitate these crab-like movements.
Yeah, it's pretty much the kind of thing we were after, was to get the feeling that there's about 10,000 human-sized cockroaches in armour scuttling around the place.
Part of their terror is about them being just sort of overwhelming mass.
And we couldn't quite figure out, we tried a few things that didn't quite work, and we were sitting around having a beer one day, and there was a bottle cap lying on the counter. The team got all these bottle caps together and put them onto the 2x4s. We strapped the 2x4s to our feet, and we went out with cricket shoes on. And we went over to Stone Street, the whole crew. It was a great day. We went over and just recorded ourselves just kind of scurrying around and making all these little weird little sounds.
David Farmer did a really amazing job with getting emotion into the cave trolls' vocals, which is something Peter was very keen to have happen, so that we could get some sort of character. The fact that this cave troll's not too bright. It walks in and it's really angry. And then it gets a bit hurt, and these things sting, and so it's got little sort of yelps of pain. Then it's getting frustrated when it's trying to find Frodo, so Dave had to come up with this huge range of emotions for the cave troll.
I had to actually fabricate the breath out of two different animals. What I really liked as an inhale was a tiger, but the exhale wound up being a Canadian lynx. So I wound up fabricating breaths: inhale, tiger, exhale, lynx. And then there's one moment where the cave troll basically realizes he's mortal. And right at that one moment, we changed the cave troll's vocalizations completely from anything aggressive or tired to a very sad, mortally wounded walrus sound.
An interesting sort of case in how the picture and the sound fed off of each other. Because Peter's idea was that as Dave was developing the sounds for the cave troll, those sounds would get sent to the animators so that they would have something to work off of. So essentially this feedback loop between the sound and the picture was created where they could co-evolve basically.
Peter's description for the Balrog was, he said, this is not a physical creature. It's basically shadow and flame.
I mean, he's made out of rock and lava, so he needs to have this sort of very natural, organic, rocky feel.
So I thought it might be good to try to make a growl out of a rock.
This just ungodly low grinding roar.
So I recorded probably an hour's worth of cinder blocks scraping across a wooden floor.
You can really hear that too. I mean, it's just this big sort of rocky scraping.
Moria is again another one of these unique locations, and you don't have much in the way of any sort of external noise sources. You've just got winds and creating the space in the mix by the use of reverbs on Foley and on the dialogue.
We did a lot of recording in natural spaces to get the sort of natural reverb sounds here. We recorded in the Wrights Hill World War II tunnels outside of Wellington, and also in the big stone warehouse.
These phenomenal tunnels that just had this reverb tail that just went on forever.
The Cave Troll, we took him in there and played him, off of a laptop and through speakers, allowed us to get the sound that David come up with for him in this natural environment that was very similar to the environment that he is in the movie.
So we took the vocalizations for the Moria Orcs and the Balrog and the Cave Troll. We recorded all those things over the speaker in there.
The idea with the Black Riders is they're almost anti-life. So when they are introduced in this scene, they're really sort of sucking the life and the energy out of the environment. We really were able to make that point by dropping away all the backgrounds, dropping away really all the other sounds.
Putting in birds flying away and the horse. Peter was wanting this really wheezy, asthmatic sounding horse vocals, again to reinforce the unhealthy nature of these wraiths.
One of our final screenings we had, this is after we've completed the final mix. PJ turns to me and said,
"Well, I think we need to get on those wraiths. I don't think there's anything there worth saving."
They're not scary, they're not chilling, they're not working.
The problem is the element we like, I only have one of. So I played the element for him. And he said, "Oh, Fran can scream like that."
In terms of Peter directing it, I think that it possibly wouldn't have been made if he hadn't agreed to direct it.
And so we dragged Fran onto the Foley stage.
And she stood there and she kind of took a deep breath in.
And got the most spine-chilling screams I've ever heard in my life. They just about knocked me on my ass.
And that wound up being a huge element in the ring wraiths, That gives them a lot of their piercing body.
The ring in the script is very much a character. It has a force and a presence and an energy.
When I first started playing with ring sounds with Peter, we were going for an actual, more physical ring sound.
And that turned into the ring having an actual voice. And that really changed into it being an actor who would remain the consistent voice of the ring throughout the film.
Alan Howard quoted voice-overs that Philippa and Fran would write.
"Tell me, you heavens, in which part of his body shall I destroy him? Whether there, or there, or there, that I may give the local wound a name and make distinct the very breach whereout Hector's great spirit flew. Answer me, heavens."
He learned a whole bunch of phrases in black speech and he just went for it. So scenes involving Galadriel, there's quite a few shots that were shot at 33 frames. It was to give it that dreamlike floaty, not quite real, you're not quite there, but you are sort of feel. So you've got slow-mo pictures, but with real-time dialogue.
So it's all lip sync. The actors have got to be precise in their delivery of that so that it's exactly in sync with their lips on screen.
When we came to ADR it, we had those pictures sped up effectively.
Things that were, things that are, and some things that have not yet come to pass.
To be as though it was shot at 24 frames. When Galadriel is in fact tempted by the ring and does the Dark Queen moment, that was shot at 48 frames. So that's a 100% time expansion. Kate, Blanchett reeled off her lines at a fair clip.
In place of the Dark Lord, you would have a queen, not dark, but beautiful and terrible as the dawn, treacherous as the sea, stronger than the foundations of the earth. All shall love me and despair.
So that when it played back at the slow motion sequence, there was still cadence, rhythm, and it still had some shape in it, actually.
In place of a Dark Lord, you would have a queen, not dark, but beautiful and terrible as the dawn, treacherous as the sea, stronger than the foundations of the earth. All shall love me and despair.
Wormtongue was a rather interesting character. We asked the Foley team to give him you can't make him slimy, but a sort of a slithery sort of sound. So they did all this work with his cape, with his robes, trying to get a nice smooth when he moves to try to get this creepy
snake-like presence. The Wormtongue sweeteners, we did have a whole slew of them that we were able to sort of slip in to little moments just to give him that extra edge of creepy snakiness.
Yeah, I mean, because basically Brad Dourif's a great actor and he can really put that creepiness into his performance. It was unfortunate that large amounts of his original production we couldn't use because of insanely bad camera noise.
Who knows what you've spoken to the darkness in the bitter watches of the night, when all your life seems to shrink, the walls of your bower closing in about you, a hutch to trammel some wild thing. So fair, so cold, like a morning of pale spring still clinging to winter's chill.
In terms of the vocal elements of Gollum, there are two main areas of sweeteners, the dog growl sweeteners that Dave Farmer was working on, and these throat chest rattle sweeteners that Craig Tomlinson developed. In terms of the vocal palette, those were the two main elements, but we ended up not really needing to use too many of them. And then the other main sort of sound effects for Gollum is really Foley that the guys at Redline in Australia did, which is really, I think, what sells him as a real character. Foley basically is all the human movement in the film. So it's mostly footsteps and things like people patting each other on the arm. It's also the movement of the cloth, their clothing on their bodies. It's interesting to watch Gollum without any of the Foley in for him. He just sort of floats. It doesn't really feel real in the same way as when you have the Foley in there, it really connects him, gives him weight. And the first Foley test that came back for Gollum, they were sort of playing him as he looks, very light. And one of the directions we sent back to them is make him heavier than he looks, because it's going to help sell him as a real character.
The guys did most of his hand moves and stuff with slightly damp hands or slightly damp rock. And so he had this wet body move sort of thing going on for him as well, which was used quite lightly.
Yeah, the direction there was actually to sort of, like we do for characters who are wearing clothes, they do a cloth pass at the end where they basically just go through the whole
reel and do sort of cloth movement for every character. And we asked them to do the same for Gollum, but just with his skin movement. And that was useful in places just to help give him presence. With the second movie, we're going to have a whole lot more crowds. I was thinking specifically about how are we going to get the sound of 10,000 Uruk-hai.
You could record a few people and double it and double it and double it and double it and create the sound.
But that just doesn't have the dynamic range and the weight and the spread and the size of what a real crowd would be.
That's when the idea of recording at the cricket stadium came up.
The crowd were really wound up because New Zealand had batted first and had got a pretty good score, and so at halfway through I kind of had to stride onto the middle of this bloody cricket pitch, and I had to explain to the crowd what we were doing and get them to chant the Black speech looking at the words flashing up on the screen.
He had them pounding their chests, back and forth. He had them stomping. He had them doing all these different things that could then be used.
Of course, when Christopher Lee's doing the speech, on the day that we shot the film, I wanted to give him something to react to, so I asked any of the crew to gather round in front of Christopher, and at all the appropriate moments, they would sort of cheer and clap. And if you listen to the original recordings that were done in the studio on that day, and then you listen to what the 25,000 people do, it's sort of, you can see what the sound design of a film has to actually accomplish.
Creating the world of Fanghorn Forest before we're introduced to Treebeard is very much part of the story.
We wanted to make it sort of dank and wet and foreboding, but not necessarily give away what's in the forest. But there are some tree growls here and there. Actually, one of the better vocals is actually a cow, a way pitched down cow.
We knew that John Rhys Davies was going to be doing the voice of Treebeard.
Treebeard is my name, according to some.
We thought about different processes that we could do to give it this tree-like resonance. And so we ended up building a wooden box that was about 6 feet long and 3 feet square.
So we built all these baffles inside of it so the sound would have to travel around in different sections. We could try different things.
We put his voice through there, the recorded lines through there, and recorded it, and then put the recording through again and re-recorded it.
Man immortal, man with axes, man with fire.
So we could get these layers of wooden resonance.
They come with fire. They come with axes, gnawing, biting, breaking, hacking, burning.
Basically, I went and recorded everything I could of a tree. I grew up on a farm, and my father was actually thinning a stand of trees. So I went over there, and we actually cut down about 50 trees. The tree falls wound up being largely what the Treebeard and footsteps are made from.
So our first pass at that, we played a very complicated, powerful Treebeard, and Peter was like, whoa, hang on, it's too much.
I am no tree. I am an ant.
It went through a lot of stages, a lot of experimentation before we finally got something which we liked and that Peter liked.
Nobody cares for the woods anymore, little orc.
We're not orcs. We're hobbits.
The White Wizard will know.
For the scene when Gandalf appears as like a white figure, we didn't really want the actual audience to know immediately that it was actually Gandalf.
Peter's idea was he wanted both Gandalf and Saruman's voice to be molded into one.
So we got both Chris Lee and Ian McKellen, and we even asked Ian to try and do a bit of a Chris Lee impersonation as well to help us sell it.
You are tracking the footsteps of two young hobbits. They passed this way the day before yesterday.
You are tracking the footsteps of two young hobbits. They passed this way the day before yesterday.
I got the lines together, matched them up, and then using the volume graph in Pro Tools, was able to just ramp one in and one out and get them to kind of morph like that.
I put Mike through a little bit of hell, I think, on the stage because I was like, oh, we got to make that better. That's not working. And then he'd like fiddle a little bit, and then we'd screen it, and I'd say, oh yeah, that looks good. That really works. And then we'd play it again. I'm like, that doesn't quite work. Do you think you can make that any better?
It took quite a few goes to get something that actually did work, that didn't sound too clunky.
You are tracking the footsteps of two young hobbits.
Where are they?
They passed this way the day before yesterday. They met someone they did not expect. Does that comfort you?
Who are you? Show yourself!
The Warg attack wasn't so much difficult as it was a lot of fun and a lot of work.
After what happened with the Wraith vocals on Fellowship, where we had to change them in the 11th hour, we knew that sort of thing might come up again.
At that point, I was thinking, what's wrong with this mix? There hasn't really been any sort of major rethink on any sound design. And then, sure enough, like 5 minutes later, Pete's like, those wargs, I don't know if they're quite right. I'm like, oh, good. This is it.
He wanted to hear much more of like dogs howling and things in the distance.
We needed to finish that reel that day, so Dave Farmer had a few hours pulling together all these vicious pack of dog sounds.
I actually had to go record myself doing dog sounds. You know, if you can't record it, you mouth it.
They're here.
For the Fell Beast, from the beginning, I kind of knew that I wanted it to be a donkey. So I went on the hunt for donkey roars. Most of what you get is the hee-haw stuff, that you really can't use anywhere. But I did get a few bellows out of the donkeys. Before I ever even came on board, they'd recorded a cheese grater on a string.
That tail movement is actually the cheese grater switch.
Peter's direction from the beginning was he wants the throb of the ring to actually be part of the Fell Beast wing flaps.
And there's that one moment when the Fell Beast rises up over the edge and all the other sounds go away except for, the Fell Beast's flapping, throbbing wings, which have merged with the heartbeat of the ring. You get that sense of pull. The ring wants to go back to its owner.
My take on it was always that this ring changes as it gets closer to home. In the second film, it's much further along in its journey, and it is going home. So it's a far sweeter, more soothing, enticing kind of character. Part of how we achieved that sound was we had a group of musicians involved with the temp music. David Donaldson, Steve Roach, Dave Long, and Janet Roddick, who has this amazing voice. And so we got her to do single notes, which we built into the overall sound design of the ring, so that when it calls, it's very sweet. But the ring is different for every person. It calls to a Frodo in a certain manner. But then when Faramir has his moment, because Faramir is more corruptible, it goes full on for Faramir and says, take me, I'm yours. Once you take me, all your problems are all over.
No!
The main thing with the Uruk army is that we knew we wanted them to have this relentless rhythm to them. The rhythm of them just swarming down on Helm's Deep.
Basically, I had taken several tracks of, say, volcano rumbles and things like this. I just had them just playing constantly. And I would just take the faders and kind of go. But when you actually listen to it back, it actually sounded like an army from the distance.
The whole time throughout this scene, we keep this pulsing rhythm going, but we let the audience know where they are by how, distinctive it is and how much in our face it is, or how pulled back and sort of amorphous the sound becomes, but the rhythm still stays the same.
Uruk-hai falling forward is apparently one of Peter's favourite sound moments. He just loves it, loves the, oh no, why me nature of the thing, you know. Here I am, you know, army of 10,000 strong, the battle hasn't even started, and I'm the first to go.
The most difficult thing from a sound effects design point of view is a battle scene. What you quickly learn when you're working on a battle scene is that less can be more, because when you're in the middle of an action scene, you think of all this sound happening all around. It ends up being too much, so you end up building in beats of silence.
An example would be the explosion at Helm's Deep. Just prior to the explosion happening, we pull all the sound out. The last sound you hear is this, whoa, as the guy dives in there with the torch to light these bombs. And that creates a moment of silence that lets the explosion be really powerful and have a tremendous amount of impact without having to be incredibly loud.
So you really get this dynamic contrast that heightens the aggression and visceral nature of the action. One of the scenes that we got a sort of initial version of was the siege on Minas Tirith when the catapult battle starts.
Ethan played it to Peter down at the theatre. And Pete just kind of said, well, have you actually heard a kind of 2-ton rock landing? Because this is what they're going to be. They're going to be bits of these buildings kind of flying over and they're going to land on the ground. And kind of, have you actually heard it? And Ethan hadn't.
He's like, why don't you just go out and do it? I'm like, that's a good idea. We'll do that. We found a crane yard up in Poirua, which is just north of Wellington, where they were willing to raise these heavy 2-ton concrete blocks 60 feet up in the air on these cranes.
And we'd spread out a number of mics just sort of at various different distances. We had a couple of microphones buried about a foot and a half deep.
In the condom, it's to just keep some moisture off it, basically, keep it clean. There's the first one going in. We're just trying to get the sound of, you know, whatever travels through the earth. Sound a little bit different.
Some of the recordings are just extraordinary. You can hear the thing coming towards you.
And drop them onto all kinds of different surfaces. It was fantastic because it gave us the sound that we wouldn't have gotten any other way.
We recorded sports teams on a practice night and used them to do the things like, in fact, running screams, run by sort of microphones screaming and that kind of stuff, and panic reactions for the general army, battle scenes and bits and pieces going on.
Now this scene is where the ring starts to pull Frodo in towards Minas Morgul. There's a lot of low-end rumble sweeps that are Dopplered, so you get that sense of movement as if they're sweeping in towards Minas Morgul, physically pulling Frodo in. And there's some singing and whispering and black speech, and that's all emanating from the ring. The beauty of this scene, for me, is the brief moment of silence before the eruption. Probably the most important tool in our toolbox is being able to create silence. And in fact, the more intense and energetic the scene gets visually, the more important of a tool silence becomes. And it actually has an inverse relationship in terms of the busier the scene is, in terms of all the sound happening, the more power that silence has. And so we're always looking for the key moment to be able to take all the sound away and just strip it down to silence.
To get a little bit zen about it, it's the whole sort of yin and yang thing. You can't make a sound powerful and big unless you've got something to actually balance it with.
This moment coming up with the Witch King is one of those moments that we're all sort of dreading. It's one of those moments when we need to physically almost feel the pain that the characters are feeling in the scene, which is coming from this just ridiculously high-pitched scream.
I can feel this blade.
So it's one of those moments we were always sort of dreading, knowing that it was going to have to be almost painful.
And that was the challenge, was to cause Frodo and Sam to actually cower with their hands over their ears. But
to be not a painful experience per se for the audience.
I remember a funny experience we had during an early tent mix on that scene, and it was one of those all-nighter tent mixes that we were going through. And sometime in the middle of the night, it must have been 3 in the morning, I was there with Mike Jones, who was doing the tent mix. We were working on that one moment, and because I'd been in there for so many hours, I think I was starting to lose perspective and probably hearing as well. And I just felt like we weren't getting enough power out of that Witch King scream. And so I kept having him turn it up. I had him put it in all the speakers. We pitched it higher. We just did everything we could do to make it stronger. And then I remember in the morning, you came in with fresh ears, and we played that for you, and you just started swearing and said, that is ridiculous.
It was just like, it started, and I couldn't get my hands over my ears fast enough.
Feel this blade.
In this extended edition, the Caves of the Dead obviously has been vastly expanded, and now we have this scene with this avalanche of skulls that come down.
So we've been working with a number of different things to try and create what we perceive that sound to be, since we don't have 60,000 human skulls at our disposal.
And coconuts, sort of come to mind, obviously. So then we took a bunch of them over to one of the sound stages and just took boxes of them and just poured them out on the ground.
We were able to rent 20 kilos of walnuts, $1 for a half day per kilo. Apparently, walnut renting is a decent business in Wellington.
Great sound, but walnuts are going to have a very bright sound quality to them, and then thousands of them, it becomes this wall of unpleasantness. Once it gets to the theater, though, I can say, it's a cool sound, so let's work with it so that we can keep what is cool about it, but get rid of the offending nature of it. It's kind of the arc of creating the track.
I really felt strongly that this Sheloves Cave should feel very just naturalistic and real. So I spent a fair amount of time torturing Bo, who was cutting all these water drips, making sure they were all in sync, and just wanting to feel the slime and the wetness and the dankness of it all.
Which has the overall effect that once we finally meet the spider, it makes the spider much creepier because your brain has already put you into like a real cave. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it isn't playing as a fantasy, it's playing as a documentary type of moment.
Right.
It's sticky. What is it?
Peter hates spiders, and so rather than sort of shy away, he wanted to sort of push the Shelob sequence into a place where Shelob couldn't be anything but the most slimy, spooky, nasty piece of spider business.
I made my first pass at doing the Shelob vocal with this alien head. The thing that I was afraid of was that it might not be scary enough. It had lots of personality and had all the qualities that you might hear from a giant spider, but the one thing it was lacking for sure was weight. Peter was drawing on this experience he had at this zoo where this alligator had hissed at his daughter. Since that had freaked him out, that was what he wanted her to sound like. I heard somebody using the steam thing to clean a jug out a few days ago. I thought it would be cool to try, maybe fake an alligator hissing. The problem with using hisses alone is that you can't make it sound aggressive, or angry. It's just sort of a hiss. which is sort of personality-less.
Someone pulled up the sound of a Tasmanian devil over the internet, and it's just the most hideous sounding animal you've ever heard in your life. And so Katie Wood ended up going to the Taronga Zoo.
There's one in the main enclosure, Salem, who just pointing my microphone at her, she would scream ferociously.
The tricky thing in making a creature when you're going to use several different elements is trying to make sure that they all sound like they came from the same beast. These sounds, strangely, they all work well together.
Barry Osborne, one of the producers from the very beginning, has been very instrumental in encouraging interaction and really sort of cross-pollination of all the different departments. I mean, especially for us in the sound department, it means being able to see what the visual effects people are up to.
On this film, we had a great sound team, and they care greatly about their work. And they can only do their work well if they're informed. So I set up a way for the sound designer to get invited over to Weta to go to dailies.
Ethan Vandren and David Farmer came to my desk one day, and I showed them what we were working on, and the Shelob shots in progress, and they got excited about it.
Not only was Shelob in the scene, but she was fully rendered, and I could actually see what her mouth was going to look like. There were actually fangs in there, and these things are all inspiration for me as I'm trying to figure out what she's going to sound like.
All of the Shelob animators trekked over to the sound studio, and we were just blown away. It's so cool. Man, seeing that stuff really gives us ideas, too.
You know, after hearing the sounds that Dave Farmer was starting to put together for Shelob, the Shelob animation team started thinking about giving Shelob's mouth a lot more character and definition.
You know, that made us go back and try really hard to live up to the sounds.
One thing that we tried very early on with the Palantir was introducing the voice of Alan Howard as Sauron coming through the Palantir, and it's I think it gives it that kind of organic and you know, spirit quality that it needs, and also sort of really makes clear that it is a device used for communication. And also the other thing with that scene with the Palantir is Billy, when he performed the scene, was jerking himself around so violently. It was interesting to be able to give the Palantir that kind of power and force that could actually throw Pippin that violently. And ended up putting in sounds that were recorded from different pieces of metal that were actually re-recorded and then played out of a speaker, which we were whipping in circles at the end of a rope. And as every time it passed the mic, of course, you get this Dopplered sound of metal, or all different actually types of grinding, sort of violent metal sounds, which gives it this sort of unique energy. And that's the force that's driving the Palantir in these weird, jerky motions.
Pippin! Help! Gandalf! Help! Someone help me!
We have probably one of the most extensive horse libraries now after these movies in the history of the world. Our approach to doing horses has been to record actual horses doing all the movements as specifically as we can get them on the right surfaces. We have recordings of huge groups of horses, which is fairly rare.
The production recorders, in fact, we're also recording wild effects of the horses for us as well.
Yeah, we're well covered in the horse effects department.
We had one editor whose sort of primary job was the horses, and so he pretty much cut horses for films 2 and 3, which meant that he basically knew the library really, really well. And so there wasn't as much time spent searching things because he basically knew, in fact, what he had as palette. And so it meant that there was a certain consistency in the way the horses were handled, which was good for the overall sound of the film, but also in other practical ways, it meant that the mixer, when he was doing effects pre-dubs, it was the same layout for his horses every reel. It was just a more efficient way of actually of sort of doing it.
Of course, he never wants to have to edit another horse in his life.
Yeah, this is true, but he was so good at it.
This is an interesting little moment that Peter picked out early on as wanting to have sort of a special sound for Theoden riding down the ranks, hitting his sword on all these spears. And so Brent spent a bit of time like getting just the right sound for that. And then we ended up, Brent cut it literally to what the picture is doing. And then when Peter heard it back on the final stage, he was like, well, I know that's probably what it's doing literally, but it feels like it needs to be faster. So we doubled it up to make it faster. And of course it works fine with the picture because it's happening so fast.
Pelennor Fields was difficult because it's such a huge sequence. It's insanity. I mean, it's completely, you know, it is the biggest battle I think I've ever seen put on film.
Although there's a tendency to kind of try and have everything playing at once but to make it really busy and seem really big, it actually kind of tends to work against you.
The only way to deal with those chaotic battles is to figure out, first of all, what to lose. Because at the end of the day, if I played everything I had, it would be loud, of course, but it wouldn't be so much loud as it would just be sonic mud.
So you pull out everything, but what is the most intense sound at any given moment? And then it's about switching quickly to another sound.
A great example is King Theoden thinking that they've gotten the better of the orcs at Pelennor Fields.
Make safe the city!
And suddenly he hears this sound. And all we hear is these subharmonic booms.
And these sort of distant roars, which you can't quite identify. From that moment, we just sort of increase. We just let it all flow towards us.
For almost every time you see a horn in any of the films in the trilogy, we went through a lot of research and played Peter lots of different variations.
The horns that we ended up with were pitched to work with the music that Howard scored. You know, some of these scenes like this one, we may have gotten to a point where it's tough to go much further until the visuals get a little more developed. And Peter didn't have a lot of sympathy for us. He was, his response was, well, you know, when I cut the scene, I had to imagine what it was going to look like. So, you know, that's what you guys should be doing. So we took that to heart and, you know, just started going for it.
Trying to sort of mentally imagine how wide the arc was that this mace was swinging when we thought that the mace was going to be hitting the ground. We had a vague idea of what the mace was going to look like, but, you know, very roughly.
Details.
So
it's all part of the process. It's good to develop the imagination.
Yeah, it was basically Peter's response was, you know, look, if you can't see it, just imagine it.
Fool! No man can kill me.
We had intended on doing a full sort of a workup on the Witch King voice, but it arrived so late in the piece we weren't able to do much to it. We had to rely upon the performance.
Witch King is one of those ones that quite a few different voices were tried out.
And I think Andy Serkis in the end was the voice we actually used for him.
Yeah. Witch King folding. It's the old tin can being crushed. Something as subtle as, you know, having the sound of the swarming ghosts over the cities, just letting that carry out a little longer, continue a little longer, really sort of helps resolve the moment into this next scene. So it's one of the nice ways that we can, you know, extend the drama through the sound.
One of the challenges with the Momakill were that, let's face it, the giant elephants.
We had spent a lot of time recording elephants in different places. And that is the sound you would naturally expect to hear when you see these trunks go up. And we played it back for Peter, and he's like, we don't want to hear that trumpet sound. It needs to be some kind of horrific bellow.
So I had to basically add tiger roars and a lion roar that was slowed down. But the lion roar is too long. So I had to take the beginning of the lion roar and the end, chop them together.
Mumakils stomping around. And then, of course, their feet, which are, like mini explosions in themselves, and which have to feel huge so that we get the size of these animals.
If you actually go to a zoo and listen to elephants walking, they're quieter than people. So fortunately, I had a lot of material from working with the Balrog and the trolls to make footsteps for the Mumakil. Big tree crashes would be added, things like that. The thing that got interesting about cutting the Mumakil footsteps was you can't cut every one you see. You can't put a sound to every foot you see falling because it'll just be overload. So what we wound up doing was only cutting footsteps for the front feet. So rather than have for one guy, it's just. The death sound for the Mumakil had to be a little bit different than the rest of the Mumakil roars, so it wound up being largely a stud horse that was having the semen taken from it. I was in the corner of the room trying to keep a safe distance because it's actually pretty freaky.
Towards the end of the movie, when Frodo is trapped up at the Orc's tower, originally we just came into that very, very quiet.
I think in the mix they realised there was really nothing kind of setting up presence of the orcs down below.
We came up with the idea of, well, what if all these other orcs that are down below in the tower are just having this sort of drunken party?
But I wonder if, like, when he's upstairs, when they're upstairs having that big chat anyway, whether there could be some noise of orcs coming from down below.
Yeah, it seems like you could do some, if there's any holes in there up in the tower while the two are fighting, or, some sort of backgrounds filtering up through that hole of all the...
Maybe we could have them playing a little jug band off screen, an orc jug band. I thought about this moment from my childhood where I woke up in the middle of the night and couldn't figure out where I was and where the sound, this drunken, music was coming from. And it sort of flashed on that when we came to this scene. And so the brief was basically, well, let's have the orcs down below be doing this drunken party. When he wakes up, it sort of will add to his disoriented state of mind.
Yeah, drunken orcs. We're drunk orcs singing. So 5 minutes in there. Can I have some drunken orcs in about 5 minutes in Theatre 3, please?
Sure.
Drunken orcs. We can be drunken orcs. Thank you very much. You can have a drink if you like. Might help.
And Dave Whitehead did a few hours work sort of putting this whole drunken rhythmic party scene together. And I think it adds a real nice, unique flavor to that scene.
Find the orc within yourself. Become that creature. That was the motivation. They lapped it up. It was good.
In the movie, there's a lot of wind, and specifically up in these scenes around the ledge, it's obviously, the wind is pretty much the only atmospheric sounds we have going. And so used a lot of quad recorded winds so that we could fill the whole room with the sound and have it feel natural. These tents are a little detail that I was sort of intent on getting just the right sound for, and some of the crew spent a bit of time searching out the right tents and getting them, actually setting them up in windy locations, and actually again recording them with a quadraphonic setup so that we could have, the sound filling the room, but to feel that it was one recording.
There are those who dwell in the mountain.
The little moment we just passed there where the wind gust comes through the tent is a sort of interesting example of how Peter sometimes shapes the track in really interesting ways, because originally we had just sort of a standard, wind gust just howling through and blowing the tent open. And when we got to that point in the mix, Peter said, I think it'd be really interesting here if we did something, if it was like the King of the Dead was actually breathing into the tent. so we ended up doing that. I think that was a really sort of interesting way to go, and it works nicely. I like the idea of actually have wind become breath. What we've done in these scenes climbing up the mountain is include a lot of steam vents, which is nice because it allows us to have sounds that come and go as opposed to being constant, which is great because we don't really want to have the constant sound of steam going, or even the constant sound of wind going, which is why with all our wind tracks we try and include a whole lot of movement and different wisps and individual little gusts, things that we can pan individually around the room. And so we've done the same thing with steam vents and with grit blows and just individual events that we can spike little moments with. And that allows us to give the feeling that there's heat and steam and wind, but without having these constant beds that just turn into noise. A sound designer's dream really is to give life and spirit to things that have no innate life or spirit, because that's something that we can uniquely do with sound effects.
Peter's brief about The Ring was that it was an actual character in the film. And so it had to have emotions, and it had to have the power to actually influence in a discernible way.
The Smeagol Deagle scene, we remixed several times. More music, less sound design. More sound design, less music.
We started with a big music score there that went right through the oncoming fight. But it was covering up the darkness, the emotion that the sound design for the ring moment had built.
That's a place where, if you will, the score goes away and we go into this more affected sort of musical sound design, in a way, heartbeat, rhythmical sounds.
What it does for me, and I think for the audience as well, is that it really puts the focus on the power of the ring to corrupt.
I think the sound helped sell the concept that the ring was doing this more than an individual was killing another individual. And it's a moment where sound design is as powerful as anything there because it helps tell the story.
The collapse of Barad-dûr was an interesting scene because we had finished the final mix on it and played it back for Peter, and he's like, well, this would probably be a good time to have a little spotting session about what we want this scene to sound like. And what he talked about was that he wanted this sort of unholy shriek to come out of the eye after the ring is melted.
You actually literally, you have to identify it as a scream of anger, pain, fear.
The trick will be trying to make the voice of Sauron more like a human, but trying to give this human voice enough power to actually rattle this tower and actually bring it down. We recorded ourselves screaming and used bits of things we had used for Sauron's eye in the past, some horsey type elements. Had to come up with a combination that all worked as one element that gave Sauron like a sort of a monster sound, but still kept him in sort of the human realm.
The collapse of Barad-dûr was difficult because with those horrific images that are ingrained in our minds of 9/11 and the collapse of the World Trade Center, I didn't want the collapse of Barad-dûr to evoke those images. I came up with the concept of making it break and fall apart like a glass tower. I said, listen, imagine this is crystal or glass and it's shattering, it's not exploding.
Craig and I went out and got some glass bits and wound up breaking those. So we coupled that with taking another piece of glass and grinding it down into the shards of the other ones. It's just a great, nice element that makes the tower sound different than everything else.
It was crucial to have our whole team right there, so when we get these sort of redesign areas of the film, we're able to get the whole team going on making this happen quickly, and then we can keep moving forward with the mix on the movie.
And for anyone else out there who's thinking about making 3 films back to back, don't do it.